I'm Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Member of Parliament for Torfaen and the Chair of the Aneurin Bevan Society. Welcome to the latest of my series of interviews with former Labour Party leaders on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the creation of the National Health Service. Today I am delighted to welcome Ed Miliband, Member of Parliament for Doncaster North and leader of the Labour Party between 2010 and 2015. Welcome, Ed. Great to see you.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
I'd like to start, if I may, with 1948 and the significance of Aneurin Bevan. I know that, like me, you're a student of history. How do you see the influence of Aneurin Bevan on healthcare and the debate?
I think his impact was extraordinary. We owe the creation of the NHS to him. There would have been some kind of health service, whoever had been the minister, because of the demands, because of the sense, the patchwork that had been inherited was just not good enough, all of that. But I think his determination, his combination of determination and cajoling, his vision, his willingness to take on people in his own side, the county councils, all of that, I think is extraordinary. And it took, such guts and determination. And he said it was a piece of real socialism. And it is. And so I think we owe an extraordinary debt to him for the creation of this piece of socialism within our country.
It's interesting you say that it is a proud institution for Britain, and it certainly is. If we think of recent years and the 2012 London Olympics and that remarkable opening ceremony that was produced by Danny Boyle, the National Health Service was a centrepiece of it. How do you see that relationship between the National Health Service and the British people over these 70 years?
I mean, people absolutely love the NHS, and rightly so. My two sons were born at the University College London, the hospital, just the same place I was born. And I think we all have incredibly warm feelings. We know when our kids are born, when our relatives pass away, the NHS is there. And wasn't that London opening ceremony extraordinary, because it's sort of, as you say, its centrepiece was the NHS. It was celebrating what was great about Great Britain, and that was the institution that Danny Boyle chose to put at the centre of that opening ceremony, and with good reason. And I, for a party election broadcast I spent some time in an NHS hospital, but sort of a bit more, if you can be under the radar with a camera, but with a sort of camera, but sort of not with lots of media. And for a couple of days, I think I was there, and it was just really interesting, without pressure, talking to patients, staff, and whatever the ups and downs of the institution, in terms of its funding and its performance, the pride in the idea and the ideal, rich and poor alike, treated on the basis of need, not ability to pay, we can all say it in some form. That is an incredible success. And the fact, as I say, the fact that I think every British citizen almost would know the philosophy. They describe it in a slightly different way, but they basically say, there when you need it, there whether you've got money or not, that idea. And it's such a powerful idea, and I think it is a sort of a socialist institution at the heart of Britain.
And it's interesting, Ed, that you mentioned then the issue of funding, because when you worked in the Treasury for Gordon Brown as Chancellor, Labour came to power in 1997. Funding was a big issue for the National Health Service after the 18 years of Tory rule. How did you in the Treasury at that time go about tackling that issue?
Well, of course, the inheritance of 1997 was people waiting 2 years for operations, an NHS in crisis, people questioning at elite level whether the NHS could carry on. And that is what the Labour government helped to turn round. And it was incredibly methodical. It was commissioning this report from Derek Wanless, a former banker, about the money that would be required to turn the NHS around, where that money would go, saying to the public, you're going to have to pay for it in higher taxes, a higher national insurance, and winning public support for that. And I think that was a great achievement. I think, social democratic parties in Europe were not putting forward tax increases at that time. It was unusual to be doing that, but it was right. And I think it shows you can win public support for extra money for the NHS because of the pride that the British people have in the institution, because of the importance of the institution, and because of their belief in the institution.
There was a very significant increase in spending. I mean, how quickly did you start to see that feed through on the ground?
I think pretty soon, once the money started going in, partly it's a morale question, but then and it went alongside, the sort of mantra was investment and reform, but it went alongside a sort of deliberate kind of decision that the money would come with certain standards that patients had a right to expect. And these targets have had a sort of slightly mixed reputation, and there are probably too many of them and so on. But talking to people in emergency medicine, for example, they all say, look, emergency medicine was turned round by the 4-hour A&E waiting, 4-hour A&E target, because it meant people were not at that point waiting on trolleys for hour after hour after hour as they had been. And emergency medicine had always been sort of slightly at the back of the queue. So it had an effect, and not all of it was perfect. There were mistakes made, probably mistakes made in relation to PFI and some other issues. But in general, the rebuilding of hospitals, some of which was through PFI, the investment that went in was very significant.
So you became party leader in 2010, but it's quite clear that there was a dramatic change in economic policy from the government. The then Chancellor, George Osborne, introduced an austerity policy that clearly had an impact on the National Health Service. And in 2012, there was the Health and Social Care Act. How do you now reflect upon those changes to our National Health Service in England?
Well, look, we went from investment and reform under the Labour government to austerity and chaos under the Conservative government. So NHS funding more or less flat in real terms, and then this unbelievable Lansley Act. Unbelievable in a number of ways. First of all, because of the sense of a top-down reorganisation, which David Cameron promised would never happen under him. Secondly, the sense that anything was fair game for contracting out. Way, way, way beyond anything the Labour government had contemplated. And then thirdly, this extraordinary idea that the sort of health secretary would no longer, if you like, be responsible for what was happening in the NHS. A sort of sense of washing your hands of responsibility. So, it was a terrible act. The government paused it, but then carried on with it. And, in retrospect, what's been happening ever since, I think, is the NHS trying to pick up the pieces of what was a terrible piece of legislation.
We think about the challenges the National Health Service faces now in England, and you think back to when you first came into the Treasury, working in 1997. Do you see similarities?
Groundhog Day. It's slightly Groundhog Day, I'm afraid. We had record patient satisfaction under the Labour government. The service had been turned round, and in a way it was sort of fit for the future. Not that the future wouldn't have been challenging. And essentially what's happened is it's gone significantly backwards. And I think it's become much more apparent to people in the last 2 or 3 years how much more backwards it's gone. And it feels very much like the 1990s. A sort of lurches from crisis to crisis. Every winter and indeed some summers is a sort of is a crisis. You've got operations cancelled, the reports of people dying, waiting for ambulances, waiting on trolleys. All of that stuff that we that I thought had sort of gone is back. And that is deeply depressing. So I think the next Labour government is going to have a task to turn it around.
And yet the status of the National Health Service in the minds of people still seems to be very, very significant. And we think of the EU referendum of 2016 and the now infamous red bus, speaking about the extra £350 million a week for the NHS. But how significant is it that that red bus chose, of all the public services it could have chosen for that so-called money, that it chose the NHS?
I think it's very significant. It was a way to win votes for Brexit. How do you win votes for Brexit? Not by putting, even immigration, which was a hot button issue in the referendum, on the bus, but putting the NHS on the bus and claiming, ridiculously and falsely, that somehow there will be 350 million a week coming back, which could go to the NHS. So I think it is significant, and I think it speaks to this. The overwhelming support there is for the principle and an idea of the NHS.
When we talk about that principle and idea, and we think about the NHS in the minds of the British people, people have come to see healthcare as a right here, a right that you can have based on need, free at the point of delivery. And I know you've spent time in the United States in the past, and it does seem to me that the debate there is very different. It seems to be based around the idea of freedom, based around the idea of healthcare as a commodity.
Yeah.
How do you reflect on the Obamacare debate in the United States?
Well, in a way, Obamacare speaks to both the desire to improve American healthcare and get more people insured, but it also speaks to the difficulty. And I think it's quite interesting the way that you've seen the evolution of the American debate. I think lots of people applaud what Obamacare was about, but there is a growing demand in America for what's so-called single-payer healthcare, which is along the lines of the NHS, because I think people recognise not only its equity but also its efficiency. I think that's something people can sometimes forget about the NHS. All of the studies we've seen, I think it's the Nuffield Trust, say it's one of the most efficient services in the world. We spend less than France, less than Germany as a proportion of our national income. But it is, and it's really important to say this to the public, it is globally an efficient service because of some of the aspects of it, because of the single payer system, because of the role that GPs play. Lots of those things add up to a highly efficient service. It doesn't mean to say you can't do better, but investing more in the NHS is investing in a service that is kind of relatively internationally well managed.
One of the issues that we have approaching the 70th anniversary is the fact that there are now very few people left alive who can remember in their adult lives what it was like prior to 1948, what that pre-National Health Service system was like, the patchwork, the way that it was generally insured male workers who had the benefit of healthcare. So how do you think now, approaching the 70th anniversary, we should still be making that case for healthcare free at the point of delivery, given that the alternative is really not there in living memory now?
I mean, I think that the best way we can make that case is by, and we're pushing it an open door, is actually the contrast with America. Because people go on the holiday to America, people have a sense of what the American debate is about. And they have that sense, they know people there, they see the coverage of it, they know that, people can simply not afford healthcare. And I actually think that the British people are there on the concept. I mean, the vast majority, and all of the polling says this. I think what does need to happen, though, and I think this is for the staff, for the patients, for the British people, is a sense of a plan going forward. A sense of, how are we going to turn this round? And it requires, above all, it requires resources. It requires investment. I am quite interested in this debate around so-called hypothecation of, extra taxes to the NHS. Labour had proposals in its 2017 manifesto, taxes on the better off. But I think, I hope very much that a Labour government will be able to answer that call for turning it round. That is what Labour tends to have to do, which is to turn things round in the NHS, following a period of Conservative rule. I think we're going to have to do that again. And I think, spending time as leader in NHS hospitals, I was really struck talking to junior doctors and staff. They were saying, and the anxiety was less then than it is now, tell us what the future is going to be. Give us a path for the future. And I think that needs to happen. I think there are interesting ideas. Again, these were in Labour's manifesto around an independent body to say, like an Office of Budget Responsibility or a climate change committee to say, here's what the resources are required for the NHS going forward. So that, I don't think you can ever take the NHS out of politics. Some people say take it out of politics, but there are political decisions on how much money, where's the money raised from. But you can take out of politics some of the technical questions about how much money is required for a certain standard of service. And at least there'd be some accountability for a Labour government or a Conservative government as to putting that investment in. But I think it is so important because, healthcare is obviously absolutely fundamental right for people, but it also says so much about what kind of country we are, what kind of healthcare we can offer. Are people going to be going back to those days when people are dying on waiting lists, waiting for operations, having operations cancelled, all that anxiety, all those problems. And yes, medical needs are great. Yes, they're growing. Yes, we've got an ageing society, but I sort of think the NHS you've got to pay for it somehow. And I think the NHS is the best way of doing it.
Do you think there'll be a National Health Service in 70 years' time?
Definitely. This is a cornerstone of Britain, an institution people are so proud of. And I think no government is going to try and take it apart. I think the danger we've got to guard against is the NHS withering on the vine and people sort of more and more concluding they've got to go private if they can afford it to get decent healthcare. That's why it needs investment. That's why it needs a government that will put the money into the NHS. But I think, it is a great institution. It is an institution the British people support. And I think it's an institution that will endure.
Ed Miliband, thank you very much.
Thank you.